Welcome, ladies. We wish we could be together discussing this great book and eating our Cuban feast, but we're doing the best we can in these very difficult times. I've got a couple of announcements to make. First of all, the next book is The Dutch House by Ann Patchett. Hopefully we can be together to enjoy a meal and a discussion of the book. But if not, Gail Lozelle is prepared to discuss that book, and she'll be doing a video if we are not able to be together. Another thing I wanted to mention is that we're working on the list for next year of books that we're selecting and our summer reading list. So look out for some emails regarding those items. We'll get them to you as quickly as we can. We're working diligently on it. Now, one of the things we were going to do today was have one of our fellow Naples Yacht Club members, Nidia Tranter, tell us about her experience leaving Cuba. She grew up during Eliza's time. Her family was friends with Batista, and she attended the New Year's Eve party for all the diplomats on the night Batista fled Cuba. In fact, that night she was whisked off to the Chilean embassy, and she spent 3 months there with her 3-month-old daughter and her husband, and there were 80 people sharing one bathroom in the Chilean embassy before she was able to come to the United States. So her story is definitely worth hearing, and if you see her around the club, please take the time to ask her a little bit more about it. Now, Nidia mentioned that she loved this book. But she said there were a couple of problems with this book. Number one, she pointed out that there was no way women in Cuba wore gloves during this time frame. It was entirely too hot, and the climate just was not suitable for women in gloves. The other thing she mentioned is there's no way that she or anyone else in that status could possibly get out of the house without a chaperone. Unfortunately, this would mean this book didn't take place, so we're kind of glad that the author decided to disregard that information. Now, to start my introduction, I just want to say, how about this book cover? It absolutely is one of the most beautiful covers, and it sucks you in even before you've read the first page. Everything from that mysterious half-covered face to the beautiful dress that she's got on, and then finally the picture of the modern-day Malecón on the bottom. My goodness, I think it's one of the prettiest covers I have ever seen. So my introduction is going to focus on the author, give some background on the book, and cover a few interesting facts about Cuba. The author, Chanel Cleeton, she's around 30 years old. Believe it or not, I had lots of information on the internet, but I could not find her date of birth. But she has written 11 prior books to this one. All of them were young adult and romance books, and you could certainly see the romance aspect when reading this book. This book was her first historical fiction book. Now, she grew up in Gainesville, Florida, so that's not far from here. Her grandparents left Cuba in 1967 with her father, who was 10 years old. Her grandfather was a physician, and he was lucky enough to be able to transfer his license to the United States. So they did not experience the trials and tribulations that most of the Cubans experienced when they were forced to come to the United States. Her Cuban background was a very strong influence in choosing this topic. She's bilingual. She lived with her parents and grandparents. She ate Cuban food daily, listened to Cuban music all the time, and heard mostly the glamorous stories of life in Cuba before Castro. Another fact that I found amazing when researching this book is she has actually never been to Cuba. Her descriptions just transform you to this country, and you feel as though you visited after reading this book. So why has she not visited Cuba? I'm going to get to that in just a moment. But the concept of the book resulted from a family gathering in 2016. This was during the Obama administration, when Cuba had been open for U.S. tourism. The family started talking at a gathering about having a reunion in Cuba to see the distant relatives and visit the beloved country. Her grandfather regaled the family with his story about a box buried the night before they were leaving for America, which included many of the things that they cherished. She grabbed on to the fascination with what would be buried in a box, and she called her publisher within a couple of days to float the idea of the novel, and of course the rest is history. But back to why she never went to Cuba. After several weeks of discussing this reunion, the grandfather fesses up and says he cannot return to support this horrible regime. He cannot give one nickel to this government. So they canceled the concept of a family reunion, and no one has visited out of respect for the grandfather, who's still alive today. It's on her bucket list. She's traveled extensively to the Caribbean, but she has not been to Cuba yet. Now, this novel, as you know, is written in a dual narrative. There's Eliza's story that takes place in 1958 and 1959, and Marisol's story that takes place in 2017. And this was done to emphasize their individual perspectives and the evolution of views based upon the generational differences, which the author, I think, handled exceptionally well. But in addition to the dual narrative, there are so many instances of a mirror narrative between Eliza and Marisol. Both of these people are young, sheltered, privileged, and both fall in love with revolutionaries. The mirror narrative resulted in some confusion for some readers and a few negative comments by the critics. Several reviewers felt that there were too many similarities between Marisol and Eliza. And if you weren't paying attention, you could easily lose track of which character was front and center. It also resulted in making the book seem a little more repetitive than necessary. And with this too much redundancy, I didn't notice it on the first read, but when I went back and reread the book the second time, I definitely picked up on this whole issue of the duplicity of it. However, I still enjoyed the book. Now, one interesting note about the dual and mirror narratives the author discussed in an interview online was her own difficulty in managing the two main characters, knowing when to switch from Marisol to Eliza. So after reviewing several edits, she finally, still confused, literally split the book into two pieces, and she did all of Eliza's narrative in one stream and all of Marisol's narrative in another stream. It was then she realized that she had a number of instances where she had to beef up a character or pull away from a character, but she said it resulted in the biggest edit that she had to complete the book, and I think it paid off. I think it kept the book very engaging in the way she switched back and forth. Now, one more tidbit about this book. When she got to the part where she introduced Beatrice, she literally stopped writing this book. And then she moved on and wrote the first chapter of the sequel book, which is about Beatrice. It came out last year, so a year after this book, and it's called When I Left Cuba. I liked it as much as this book, and I'm not usually one for sequels, but it covers a period after 1961. So if you like this book and you're still interested in learning more about Cuban history, I definitely suggest you should read the sequel book, When I Left Cuba. Beatrice was quite a character, and she comes out shining in that second book. Chanel Cleeton's next book comes out this June, 2020, and it's about the hurricane that hit Key West in 1935. The book is titled The Last Train to Key West. So she's taking a break from the Perez sisters to give us a story slightly different, but she has not ruled out a book on Isabel at this point. So to give you some background on Chanel Cleeton, she studied in England, and she actually got her JD or law degree, which interestingly enough, she says she regrets because it took a lot of time to get it, and she has never really used that degree. But she said it did make her a fast reader and a much better researcher. However, in addition to having the law degree, she has a master's degree in international politics, which is hugely instrumental in making this book so readable. She does a good job of bridging between the macro history and politics while building upon how those affect individual lives and relationships. So it makes this book educational without feeling like a textbook. Now, this book, Next Year in Havana, is basically a love story to Cuba, and Cleeton paints a perfect picture of the Cuba many left behind versus the Cuba we as tourists see today. Eliza lived a glamorous life as a sugar baron's daughter, albeit in difficult political times. Then Marisol, who had always heard of the allure the country had for her grandmother, visits Cuba and comes face to face with the harsh realities of poverty and oppressiveness of the Castro government. So Clayton manages to address what it's like to be a Cuban, whether you live there or not. And this book covers the gamut: Cuban politics, Cuban history, Cuban passion, and Cuban pride. So speaking of Cuba, it is the largest of the islands in the Caribbean. It is almost the size of Florida. Cuba has a population of 11.3 million. The state of Florida has a population of 21 million. So we are double in size of Cuba in terms of the number of people. More importantly, the gross domestic product of Cuba, being a communist country, is 87 billion annually. Florida is 10 times that. We are 815 billion annually in our GDP. So tourism is important to Cuba, and it's also important to Florida. Cuba receives 4.3 million tourists a year, and that's down 8.5% since the U.S. ban was reinstituted. So 4.3 million tourists visit Cuba. Florida has 130 million tourists visit every year. So we obviously have substantially more tourism. There are approximately 1.2 million Cubans living in the United States, and I was shocked to find out that of that 1.2 million, 900,000 live in the Miami-Dade area. So they have a huge concentration there. Now, I had the privilege of visiting Cuba for 1 week with a local guide several years ago, and Chanel Clayton, her depiction is so realistic of the current conditions. I am shocked she's not been there. The Wall Street Journal had an editorial on February 28th of 2020 by a gentleman named Andy, I think it's Lapierre, titled, "The Real Cuba is a Land of Extreme Deprivation." There's going to be an attachment to this presentation so you can read this editorial. He visited twice, and just like my visit, he was asked to bring things like vitamins, children's Tylenol, reading glasses, used clothing, and in my case, spices. As he says, you can bet that a country that wants its tourists to bring basic medicine probably does not provide a world-class medical care to its people. In fact, on our visit, we stayed in Cienfuegos at a B&B run by 2 doctors, who each made about $30 a month in US. We were the only guests staying at the B&B that night. The next morning, at breakfast, the hospital called, asking the husband to come to the hospital for surgery. He said, "I'm serving breakfast to my guests, so I'll be there after, maybe around 10. He made more money on our single overnight stay than he made working for the month, and he expressed his disdain for the medical system, which lacked the most basic necessities. The editorial again is attached. Please take the time to read it. There are lots of information which is mirrored in her book. Now, one last thing that's not really necessarily associated with this book, but many of you ask us how we pick our books. And for this month, so you can think about this, we were choosing between 2 books with very similar storylines. A Grandmother with Secrets, lots of history. So if you're ready for something similar to this book, but in a different setting, we suggest you try A Storyteller's Secret by Sejal Badani. It takes place in India. We ultimately settled on this book because Cuba is so close to us. It's only 200 miles away from Naples, Florida. It has been in the news so much recently, and of course we love Cuban food. I'm sorry we can't be together to discuss the questions, but we had actually already picked a Cuban menu. We were having Columbia House's famous 1905 salad, Cuban garbanzo bean and chorizo soup, plantain chips. The chef is going to surprise us with some recipes, cooking tips, and a demonstration, hopefully to follow this presentation. So I want to close with a quote very appropriate to these difficult times when we are homebound, and the quote is from Mary Schmidt, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and she says, "Reading is a discount ticket to everywhere. Right now, it's the only ticket we've got. Please stay safe and well, and hopefully you enjoyed next year in Havana, and please join us next month for the Dutch House." Thank you.